Welcome to Indoctrination, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein. Hey everyone. I'm excited for you to hear part one of my two-part conversation with Jamie DeWolf today. He is a very interesting and unique man who I spoke with almost 2 years ago at the very beginning of this podcast. He helped to kind of launch it along with some other significant guests, and I am very happy to have him back on the show. We've been in touch here and there, checking in with each other, and I had this thought that kind of popped into my head, and I said, I'd like to be able to talk to Jamie about this and have him back on the show. So Jamie DeWolf is a wordsmith, which you will hear and enjoy. He's an entertainer, a vaudevillian, a filmmaker, writer, humanitarian, activist, teacher, and father. And he also happens to be the great-grandson of L. Ron Hubbard. Here's Jamie now. So I wanted to be able to go over so many things, but there was this idea, not that we necessarily have to talk about cults, but sort of why not start there? I had had this phrase pop into my head many months ago that I kind of floated your way, like maybe one day I'd love to talk to you about this. And it was this catnip for cult leaders. I don't know why it popped into my head, but I thought, who do they search for? Who do they love being able to target? What turns them on? What gives them that buzz? And so what's their catnip? And also what keeps them going? Because I've come across some who really are just not well. And so they get people kind of involved in their psychosis, and that becomes a group. But there are others who are just so much more sophisticated and complicated than that. So I was curious just to start there. What do you think the catnip is?
For the cult leaders themselves?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it is disguised narcissism. I mean, one of the biggest tricks of cults is making you feel that you're empowering yourself while you're ultimately giving your money, your time, your focus, and your praise towards an individual. Yeah. And that's everything from NXIVM to Jim Jones to L. Ron. It's that it goes into a lot of phrases about we and us, but there's usually one person giving those phrases. There's one person who's the conduit, and it's really everything flipped on its side. I mean, if someone just came out and they said, I'm making a cult celebrating me, it would never work. I think a lot of people really misunderstand that right from the get-go. They're like, how come people don't know they're in a cult? How come people don't see that this is an obvious cult leader? And that's because those people, they never start by presenting it as about them. It's always about giving you power, you wisdom, you clarity, a new sense of emotional stability. And, I mean, you look at NXIVM, for example, which I've definitely been obsessed with because it's like a weird, evolved, compressed version of Scientology in some respects. And it's really all about self-betterment, but it's really all about Keith Raniere, that he is the focal point, and he never really says that this is about me, even though he's called the Vanguard and L. Ron is called Source. That they're never the god of this creation, but they act as if they are, and they're celebrated as if they are. And it's this whole disguised narcissism of basically you hide behind something that's selfless and is absolutely profiting you. I think the catnip for a lot of them is basically having that sort of arrangement where people are grateful to you for giving them the keys to this new land of opportunity and emotional control that you alone hold. And I think that that's the devil's bargain, and that's where it starts, is that when you're able to convince people of that, then you're already on the road. I mean, it really starts with just basically saying, don't you want to be a better person? Don't you wish that you could get rid of these pathologies, these things that hold you back and hang, and so that you step forward and you basically say, I am trying to help you. Let me help you. And that any resistance that you have to that, a resistance to being in control or debating who this individual is who's claiming to have this special secret knowledge.
Mhm.
And it's all built into it so that you already have counters to, basically present all of the opposition against you from the get-go. With
Right.
Scientology, it's that psychiatry is trying to stop us. With Nexium, it's that these are all these other movements that are trying to stop us because they don't want you to have access to this kind of insight. But I alone control this insight. You look at something like Jonestown, for instance, and that was all about the community. You know what I mean?
Right.
It was though it was literally called Jonestown. But I mean, it was the people's temple. It wasn't
Mhm.
Jim Jones and
Mhm.
acolytes. You know, what I mean, it's.
Mhm.
But I mean, you look at it from an objective standpoint, and you're like, well, of course, this is the person driving it. You know, what I mean, if this person dies,
Yeah.
then the whole thing evaporates.
Right.
And unless there's some kind of infrastructure that continues it forward, similar to Scientology. But I mean, David Miscavige stepped into that role in kind of a different way, and then
Yeah.
eventually ended up taking on that mantle and embodying it, of basically becoming the same role of that I am the conduit, where David
Mhm.
Miscavige is not Elron, but he's the conduit to keeping the information accurate and Scientology working, right? And
Right.
so that's where people start to fall. I mean, I think that the, intoxicating element for all of the cult leaders in general, if you had to sort of like, line them up in some sweet little club, is it starts with this intense narcissism that, you know, usually is like on the verge of megalomania, if not outright psychosis. And, um, that sort of kind of manic
Right.
depressive elements, but that you start with a fictitious biography where it's either outright lies or at the very least distortions and exaggerations. So I think for them, it really starts with having a stronger vision of themselves
Mhm.
that then is perpetuated in the minds of others. And it only reinforces it to a point where you're no longer that failure who was rejected years ago. You're now David Koresh, who's, not a struggling guitarist. You're now someone who's actually, has a divine mission, and you're getting people in line with that. And I think it also always gets kind of doesn't get looked at enough, but the inner circle in those early days is so key to the longevity of their mission. A lot of them, there's usually power struggles kind of near the start because other people sign on to the sense of community and a sense of we,
Mhm.
and they realize pretty quickly that that's not going to be the case. You know
Right.
what I mean? That they've been sold this line, but that it's absolutely driven by this one individual and is really a manifestation of their will and their kind of persona. And so then you find these power struggles in the early days. And then often the leader, the eventual leader, successful and victorious in those struggles, and then continues. And then
Mhm.
they make this sort of core circle, which are like really kind of their pit bulls and some of the most dangerous people in the organizations, because they're the true blue soldiers. And they're the ones that are often on the other side of the rainbow and actually know all of the issues that are really like actually behind the curtain. These are the people who know all of the lawsuits, all of the enemies, all of the different crises that they have to contain, but at the same time still have this endless devotion to their leader.
Okay. Okay. Right. So that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Uh, what I find is so interesting also about this inner circle, I'm thinking about R. Kelly. I'm thinking about a lot of people
Yeah,
who have
R.
people
Kelly's a
around
great
him.
example. You see this, yeah, you see the same dynamic happen over and over, and R. Kelly is a great example, a very kind of low rent example in some ways. Sorry just to jump in while I'm thinking of it, but
No.
I noticed it even in his tweets that he's used to defend himself. He's constantly stating like we, it's like, they're not going to take us down like that.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
and then you start to also, if you don't have a community, then you start to really reach, and he's like, this is, you are lynching a black man, that the trying to mobilize the African American community behind him. And, you kind of pick your different shields. That way you're not what is pretty naked when you look at the hard facts of, which is one person who's kind of greed and their sort of carnivorous ego is
Mhm.
the one that's constantly devouring this. And everybody else is falling in line a lot of times because of money. And R. Kelly is a perfect example. A lot of that was money.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it is money, and I think, when you have people right around you, which narcissists do, who will consistently feed your ego and also keep your secrets,
Right,
then you have this cushion,
right.
and you have people also who will not only do it for you, but they're gonna do it for themselves because they don't wanna lose that standing. They want to be able to look good in your eyes, but they probably, at that point, also have seen what you do with people and to people who disappoint you.
And there's a sense of like, I'm a genius, but I'm trying to help you and I'm trying to help the world. And
Mhm.
I'm, devoting myself to it. And even Steve Jobs, it's like, he has such this cult of personality about it, which is also really strange, because even if you read about him, for example, he had his inner circle and he didn't even create all of the things. I mean, he had teams and designers and the nine, and he sort of gets handed
Yeah.
this bizarre mantle that gets promoted by a company that continues to profit off of that model. I mean, I'm obviously talking on a Mac right now, but I mean, is that it perpetuates, if it pays to keep up that sort of, amazing myth that this person was special and that they need to be given different kind of uh, a different kind of respect and different kind of allowances because they were so special and unique, and that can explain and rationalize all of these different awful things about the human being or whatever, because in
Mhm.
the end it's like, but I gave this to you, and that
Mhm.
sort of thing. Just been really fascinated with Elizabeth Holmes and Thanos, who basically
Yes.
created this amazing empire off something that never worked, that never worked. And she was just so determined to say that this machine that I've invented with our proprietary technology can take one, drop of blood and do all these tests on it. And medical professionals at the very start of it were like, this is almost impossible. I mean, this is like there's a reason why this hasn't been able to have been done before. And
Mhm.
she was like, no, we are doing this. This is what we're doing. And she was able to make this happen for like 7+ years and get national contracts, really kind of by sheer force of personality, where people really bought into this kind of Steve Jobs sort of cobbled together persona, which she even tailored to wear the turtlenecks and to dress the role and to become this archetype that would have become an archetype at that point. But I mean, it covered up all of the obvious stuff that would have already there in her bio, that she had no medical training, that this thing had never worked, that there was a reason why it had never been invented. You know what I mean? Like, you're able to sort of flip everything on its side and be like, well, that's why it's never been invented, because no one has been me. No one has been me to make this happen. And,
Right.
then finally they call the bluff. I mean, that's science. So problem is with science is it has to actually do something. Um,
Yeah.
and you have to verify it with evidence.
Mhm.
So the kind of doom was written into that recipe early on.
Yeah.
But, and I think that Scientology is very similar. It started as a science.
Mhm.
And once they quickly realized that none of it was, going to be able to be proved or verifiable or have any case studies or evidence or anything, then you just flip it into a religion so that all of that stuff that's glaringly obvious, that's already there in the record of these first clears, right? That Elron was bragging about, the first
Mhm.
clears,
Mhm.
who are not superhuman people. I mean, it was a huge flaw in the whole kind of design of what they're bragging about. Is like he's bringing on the first clears, and like, and there's that classic embarrassment where people are asking him, what color took for him the first clear to close his eyes, and then what color was Elron's tie, and things like
Mhm.
that. He was standing
Mhm.
next to him on stage, and the guy couldn't remember, and because they were trying to test this sort of
Right.
superhuman qualities,
Right.
and so then the science starts to fall apart, and so then you turn it into a religion,
Mhm.
and then those same absolutely verifiable events that are already there in the record for anybody to find you flip those on your head and you're like, well, those folks weren't able to do that because they hadn't taken on these extra levels that we're now inventing. And so it's kind
Oh,
of a constant sense of counter moves. And
yeah.
I think that always attack, never defend maxim from Scientology is always really stuck with me in terms of watching how the president deals with his enemies, how a lot of these different kinds of cults react is that there's no soul searching or accountability,
Mhm.
because you have to be 100% right. And so
Mhm.
anybody who steps against you has to be absolutely crushed and smashed.
This is fascinating. I'm so glad you brought this up because it's reminding me of that expression. I don't know who originally said it, so if anyone listening knows, please let us know. That there's nothing as unifying as a common enemy.
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
so, right, that I think that people then have this sense, it's same thing with siblings, if they can kind of like trash one and side with the other, and that gets a lot of play. Um,
If someone breaks into your house, you're on the same side immediately. You know what I mean? So
yeah, exactly. And so right. So right away there's an enemy, right away there are issues around trust. It's also such a deflection because then you think the person who is telling you about who you can trust and who you can't, then is saying that because they care about you. So you then think you can trust them, even
right,
though they're playing you.
right.
And you don't realize it because now you're focused outward. What I noticed also, I never thought about this, but while you were talking, I was thinking that what's so insidious, not only about what happens within culture groups and also really pathologically, sort of narcissistic relationships,
Mm.
is that not only do you have the sense that you have people on the outside who are the enemy, but also somehow you're the enemy, that you can't be trusted, that somehow there's something wrong with you, or you're going to let yourself down unless you stay with this, or you're never going to find someone else who will love you in the same way. So you might as well
Yeah,
stay here. It's
right.
really fascinating that you you learn to turn on you as well.
Yeah, well, you make it about, as someone who's definitely been in some toxic relationships on both sides where, they've been horribly toxic and I've been horribly toxic. And yeah, the easiest thing to do when you're a piece of shit, which I certainly have been in, especially in my earlier relationships, is that you are any kind of insecurities, anything that you're out of control on, you blame the other individual for, because then it puts it in their court and then they have to debate with their own insecurities and their own instability and what they're not in control of. And in toxic relationship, what you guys aren't in control of usually
Hmm.
is your attraction to the other individual,
Hmm.
that your sort of chemistry and whatever got you there in the first place could sometimes feel uncontrollable. And so these toxic
Hmm.
relationships is that someone learns to try to take that control, and you get this sense that, like, you're never going to love like this, someone's never going to love you the same way that they do, that though they may be abusive and fucked up, that they are, that's because they're so passionate, and that that's in some way your fault. I mean, I think it's also that you make this deflection, because everybody's fucked up. Everybody is a kind of a walking mess, and some people hide it better, some people have more in control, some people are just more well balanced, whatever. I mean, there's a scale of that, and but I think that people who are wrecks are often searching for that kind of person that has that kind of balance to balance them out. And
Hmm.
if it starts to tilt the other way, they're going to blame the person opposite. I mean, it's just constantly like flipping it back and forth.
Hmm.
And the only way to, for anybody to mature or grow or to have any kind of like a real actual relationship is where accountability, it's like where you're like, okay, we are both responsible for this.
Hmm.
This is what
Hmm.
I did wrong. This is what if I'm not accountable about this, then we're never going to move forward. Or if we do, it's going to be some distorted sham of a relationship. It's more dangerous than anything is that gray zone of where people are able to kind of be from your side. I mean, I think that's why all cults attack their ex-members so viciously, probably more than almost anybody else, because they know that that person has the vernacular and the language to walk someone through the other side. You know what I mean? That they are a middle ground to be like, hey, look, I've been on the other side, I've been on your side, but this war is not what you think it is. They may not know all of the complex belief systems that they are actually indoctrinated into. But I think if you ask most of them, it's pretty clear early on who the enemy is. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, if I don't do this, then this and this is going to happen. You know what I mean? There has to be this cause and effect. And that mentality is pretty huge. Because if you don't have it, you don't have the same sense of control. And people won't fight for you without you being there, commanding them to do it the way that they do in other cults and also that people are having to fight their own minds in order to, take any steps forward. And that's what I think is the most haunting is, what people are wrestling with.
One more thing before you go. It's always interesting and a pleasure to speak with Jamie DeWolf. You will get to hear the second part of my conversation with him next week. And you can also hear my original conversation with him around the time that this podcast started almost 2 years ago, which is unbelievable. It blows my mind. And also another conversation we had that is part of the special content for Patreon subscribers, where he gets into some nitty-gritty behind-the-scenes family secrets. So go to patreon.com/indoctrination to support the show, to be able to keep it on the air, and also to be able to listen to Jamie's exclusive interview for Patreon subscribers, and also any of the other content that's there. I want to talk today about something I brought up with Jamie. This phrase that popped into my head one day, and I thought he would be a great person to kind of tease this out with me, and it's this idea of catnip for cult leaders. Please know that when I say cult leaders, it's also in reference to controllers of any sort, pathological narcissists, sociopaths, very controlling or emotionally manipulative or emotionally abusive people in your life. Actually, in your life in a variety of contexts, whether it be in a relationship or someone you work with or someone you work for, someone who was in your family system while you were growing up, etc., whatever the situation is or was. So just as catnip is something natural that is a kind of grass that makes cats and presumably other animals as well, but mainly cats, react in a way where they're kind of intoxicated, and then they're drawn to it in the same way that people are drawn to a drug, I started wondering what would be that kind of catnip for a cult leader or controller. What do they look for? What draws them to you? What gives them that high off of you? I often say, and I'll say it again today, that usually people who are trying to control others are looking for certain kinds of qualities like potential subservience, people who are introspective, people who take responsibility for things, whether it was their fault, whether it was their responsibility at all or not. And then the person controlling them will know that they won't be blamed for things or even held accountable potentially for things they did wrong or things they said wrong. And they absolutely love having that out. It's like a safety net for them to know that they can do something wrong and the other person might think it's their fault and blame themselves and make a promise to try harder the next time to be somehow better, even though they didn't do anything wrong. Cult leaders do find that this gives them a high, knowing that they're going to have that safety net, that out. But people also will look for certain qualities in you if they're trying to control you. And sometimes those are wonderful qualities, like the ability to become devoted to an idea, devoted to an ideal, devoted to a person or a belief. Somehow you have this part of your personality where you get kind of pumped up and caught up. And within a cult, that's not a good thing because you're caught up in a high that might bring you outside of the life that you want to be living and in an alternate space where you are no longer able or at liberty to protect yourself. And also, the life that you were promised, well, none of that is happening. And so it's just taking you farther afield from reaching your own goals. And you're so caught up and you're so manipulated that you have these blinders on that they have created for you, where you don't notice what's really happening there and how much you're being used or confused or abused. It's like being put in that honeymoon period that we feel at times at the beginning of something exciting, where we're not noticing the warning signs in the same way that other people might notice them right away who are not caught up and not swept away. Please remember always that your value should never be based upon how much you sacrifice for another person, but based upon your inherent value as a human being. I will say it again. Please remember always that your value should never be based upon how much you sacrifice for another person, but based upon your inherent value as a human being. Narcissists don't like that message. And narcissists don't like it because they don't like narcissistic withdrawal. That kind of aching emptiness and terror sometimes that comes from having this moment where they think the person they're controlling is no longer fully intimidated by them and can no longer kind of be completely devoted to them, doesn't fall for their lies anymore, and isn't completely just focused on them, but might have divided allegiance and might be missing other people and might be focused on suddenly other things when they, the narcissist, need to know that you are completely focused on them and no one and nothing else. It becomes such a primal and painful feeling for them that they can't work their magic, but they will work hard to get you back on track to fill their emotional needs. And they will work hard to try to see your renewed devotion, your renewed unquestioning loyalty and belief, and your renewed self-sacrifice, and your renewed service to them. And that's part of their drug. But here's the secret. That while they cultivate this high in you, you are actually their drug. A lot of people say that they felt that being involved in a controlling environment like a cult or in a relationship with a narcissist, at least at first, felt very much like being intoxicated, being on a high. But you're also feeding your controller's emotional drug habit. You are the catnip. It's good to remember that. And I say that in an empowering way, because if you remember that, you see in that moment, and hopefully remember in that moment, that you're the one with the power. You're the one who can keep them from getting their fix if you pull away. And while they won't like it, and they'll let you know that, and they'll try to scare you into not pulling away, and they will try to manipulate you more to try to get you to stay devoted. And their threats of punishment will become more intense. All of these kinds of techniques, though, all of these kinds of reactions to you pulling away should give you insight into just how powerful you are, because it shows you just how scared they are about losing their drug of choice, which is you. You hold the power. You hold the power to not feed their habit and make them drunk with their power over you. They don't deserve it. They come across as strong and as intimidating, but this is a sign of weakness. If these controllers were actually truly strong and confident and knew how to live their lives without needing to take advantage of other people and knew how to build themselves up without needing to drain energy off of other people in order to increase their own, then I would see them as strong people who I respect. Otherwise, they're just very clever and manipulative and ultimately insecure and fearful emotional addicts. Talk to you next week. I'm excited to say that this podcast is now available on additional platforms. If you want to listen to Indoctrination, it's available for download on the NPR Radio Public app, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Please support Indoctrination at patreon.com/indoctrination. We now have a big library of content that you can access with any donation. And subscribers receive bonus interviews and other cool goodies. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. Thank you for your support.